Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our first interactive session of Guyana's Oil and You. I am your hostess this evening, senior journalist of Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilburg, and we have with us this evening for tonight's discussion Dr. Remy Piet. He is the co-founder of Ambulé Advisory and faculty member at the University of Miami and HEC Paris in Qatar. Welcome, Dr. Piet.
Pleasure. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay, and yourself?
Great. It's always a pleasure to be with you and talk about those issues together.
Thanks. So tonight's discussion is centered on local content and what it means and how Guyana can actually be successful with local content for its oil and gas industry. And tonight we want to hear from our listeners. And if you'd like to share your thoughts, you can call us in studio on 226-7453, or you can send us a WhatsApp message or SMS to 6222 222. I'll go those numbers again. You can call us on 226-7453, or you can send us a WhatsApp message or SMS on 6222 222. That said, Dr. Piet will get into tonight's discussion. So let's start off a bit simple. What is local content? When we hear the phrase local content, what should Guyanese be thinking?
So local content is one of the main way that a foreign investment can participate to the development of a national economy. So that, especially in the case of Guyana, it's used mainly for the energy sector, but it could be actually applied to other sectors in terms of foreign investment and the translation into local value and local development. Here, when you're looking at trying to achieve local content, you look at direct jobs, obviously. You look at indirect jobs also, and induced development. So what I'm saying by direct jobs, people working for the company. So the amount of workers from Guyana, for example, as opposed to expats, the amount of, when you look then at indirect jobs, which are more the subcontractors, the amount of production services, inputs that are made in the country as opposed to imports from outside. And then induced is the series of local development in the, let's say, hospitality sector, in the, leisure sector, maybe restaurants, other, but also maintenance of equipment, for example. So there's a series here of types of contribution to the local development. But basically, to make it simple, local content is the contribution from foreign investment to the local economy. How do you achieve this, and how do you achieve this in the long run, and make sure that every company and the government also puts in place the right policies? Now, that's a long debate, but the concept itself is simple.
Great. So when we hear local content, we're supposed to be thinking about the hiring and training of our people and the use of local companies for the supply of goods and services. And also another important aspect of local content, if I might add, is the building of capacity. And as you rightly said, there's so many ways that a country can achieve this by putting together a policy that is context specific. And I'd like to dive into that because there's so many good examples around the world that Guyana can look to as it pursues efforts to create its own local content policy. And I'd like us to start there. What are some good examples that we can look to in terms of ensuring that when we put together this policy, it's actually giving Guyanese first preference in the oil sector?
So let me just take a step back just to put a little more context. First of all,
Right.
I completely agree on the contribution, economically, but also in terms of training, of knowledge. We had a recent, conversation, you and I, on the sustainable development goals and how the extractive
Yes.
sectors could be a vector for development of capacity, not only jobs, which we mentioned in local content, but trying to also to quantify inside this local content the element of social and governance and more transparency and others, ways to operate, ways to develop a business also in a country, to learn how to learn new skills. For example, the training element is important. Now, looking at how do you achieve this, there are different countries. I mean, I have a publication coming around now on looking at different cases in countries in Africa, countries in Asia, for example, which have relatively the same type of development. You have to understand that obviously there's a gap of perception between the country, which believes that it owns, the resources. I mean, actually, it owns the resources, and in return for the depletion of that resource, and the benefit that a company can get from also harvesting this resource, they hope to get as much local content and development as possible. On the other perspective, you have the energy company, which operates on international markets with a series of norms, standards that do apply, and there's sometimes not the existing local ecosystem to be able to supply those services and products to a large investor, and you need to be able to gradually, incrementally develop this local content. So how do you achieve to this? And you have right now a discussion on in Guyana in terms of turning the policies in terms of a law, and whether or not there should be a quota into this. Those are very valuable questions, and there are countries that actually applied quotas, others did not. But the most important part of this is really to look at the process in terms of developing this local content, trying to find the partnerships and the long-term vision towards achieving this local content. It's in particular in diversifications, not only oil or energy services, but also trying to help the diversification of the economy in those induced type of development. And all this takes time. So if you have a very rigid quota right off the bat, let's say, without having an incremental basis of this quota, and without more than anything, the commitment of different stakeholders, the companies and the government to talk together transparently about how to grow those local businesses, then you actually can't achieve the objective, which is the sustainable development of the country. So more than the actual number, it's the process which is much more interesting and important. And there are, as you were saying, some interesting cases. I've looked at Mozambique, I looked at other countries in Latin America, which actually propose clear angles of how to develop and implement local content. The series also of platforms, online platforms that allow for also citizens and companies to be informed of what's existing out there. I can go more in detail, but I'm also very happy to hear about potential questions, from the phone or WhatsApp. I'd be happy to answer any questions out there.
Great. So, on that note, I'll just remind our listeners that you can partake in this discussion and share your thoughts on local content. You can send us questions if you have on this matter, and you can do so by either calling us on 226-7453, or you can send us a WhatsApp message or SMS on 6222222. So, just to return to our discussion, Dr. Pierre, you mentioned very important mechanism that countries use to achieve local content to ensure that their citizens are given first preference in the oil sector, and that's the use of quotas or quantitative targets. And I know that in the case of Nigeria, they would specify that they want to see a certain number of local content being achieved in the area of the engineering aspect of the oil and gas industry, or they want to see when you're building the FPSOs, they want to see a number of Nigerians partaking in that. And so before we can even begin to set targets, I think many of the discussions that I've had with experts over the years is that you need to know what the country has and what the country doesn't have before you can begin to say, well, the companies or the oil companies must achieve this particular target by the end of the year. So what are your thoughts on that? The importance of Guyana ensuring that it does an assessment of where it stands before calling for targets.
Well, there are some works being done out there, and there are good experts that have been working on the mapping of capacities from in Guyana. Obviously, they could be improved. A series of companies have engaged in that process, sometimes only by themselves. It would be better maybe to share information and just try to have a more comprehensive perception. But there's academic experts also that have looked into this. So there are possibilities. There are sectors obviously that could be gaining from the technical knowledge of the energy industry. There are also a series of traditional supply to the energy sector. On these questions, you have good professionals in the energy sector in Guyana, strong companies that know what what they're working with. But the question is obviously, as I said, to be able to put in place this institutional governance in terms of engaging in fruitful roundtables with stakeholders, government representative, energy companies, to be able to explain what is the objective, and try to highlight very quickly potential partners on the ground. One of the issues that I was saying in terms of this perception gap is that having every potential suppliers standardized internationally is great, but at the same time, there's going to be contract for 2-3 companies. And so the objective is rather to just try to concentrate into consortiums and therefore have them, grow and be a partner of the energy company, rather than to have, huge expectations from everyone, and just be very aware that, the main elements of the jobs created by a large investment is actually the induced jobs, not the direct, obviously employees, or the indirect, but really much more the capacity to understand that there's going to be much more business to be done in the hospitality sector, in the infrastructure sector, in issues of obviously education, training, all those new jobs that are created with the capacity to create the knowledge that will be needed by Guyana in 20, 30, 50 years. We're talking about this when we're talking about local content also. So just having an idea of a mid to long-term perspective, highlight key partners, and have transparency in the process, with capacity to have public hearings organized potentially through online tools. There are some of them that I could advise on, and be able to answer questions so that it doesn't create resentment and it doesn't create overblown expectations. Not everyone will be hired directly by the oil company, and that's not the objective. The objective is to find what are the livable and interesting projects on the ground in the vicinity of the companies setting foot in Guyana, and trying to see how you could use the knowledge from the oil company or different component to grow your own business. And that's the part of it which is very interesting, if we can have this clear, transparent process with stakeholders, energy companies, government, and into an online process and tool that we can go deeper into this.
Great. Thank you for that contribution there. So I'd like to turn your attention to the aspect of procurement, and this is a really big part of local content as well. Using and ensuring that the oil companies, the players in the sector, they give first preference to local suppliers in the procurement of goods and services. And I know that there many examples around the world where countries would have taken different approaches to ensure that at the end of the day, the majority of that expenditure that's set aside for procurement, it goes towards local companies. Now, what are your thoughts on this, on how Guyana can ensure that it puts together a policy in having provisions looking at procurement, and it gives first preference to Guyanese, that the majority of the money is funneled to Guyanese companies? I know one of the ways that Angola does this is by mandating that if a foreign company wants to get a piece of the action or get a piece of the procurement pie, then it has to partner with a local company. So,
absolutely.
and in doing that, there's a transfer of knowledge, there's a transfer of skill sets, and even the building of capacity of locals. So, we can build on that as we go. What are your thoughts?
Well, there's a whole range of different countries, and obviously there's a link with their history also. You mentioned some countries where there needs to be a local participation. In Qatar, there's got to be a 51% partner in every investment in the country in all sectors. So obviously that's really much more in terms of the extreme. In other countries, in Botswana, for example, which has been fairly successful in Africa relatively with other countries, there's actually not a quota in there's a local content policy, much as the situation in Guyana. Now, moving from local content policy to local content law is interesting and gives really a tool for the state and government to enforce the fact that every company have to be part of this. That gives the legal backing to be able to seek either penalties, incentives, different ways to make sure that it becomes binding. Now, as I was saying, it's not a finality. It's not the end game here. The objective is not only to have a law and potentially a quota set number. Better it would be incrementally, as I keep saying, and trying to work, specifically with companies understanding this incremental curve, but also, as I was saying, maybe being more ambitious in terms of pushing towards the process behind. In 1 year and 2 years, or having a real commission investigating in a good sense, then being able to show that the process is clear, is transparent. Guyana needs this. Every country in the world needs this. Let's be very honest. But Guyana needs to have more stability and governance, institutional strength in terms of those processes because of the importance of the energy sector for the country. And there's clear good people on the energy sector, good people in the government that understand that also. So hopefully inside the legal framework, it will be more than the policy, the binding element, obviously, including a quantitative element, but a process also of being able to follow the fact that there is this consultation and dialogue of who can achieve, what are the possibilities and the long-term forecast, and how does it fit with the sustainable development of Guyana in general.
Great. So as we talk about procurement, and you've also mentioned some really good points there, the importance of having a law that gives the government that sort of backing to ensure that there's compliance with what it expects from the companies in the oil sector, and especially as it relates to local content. Now, I want to turn your attention to the area of employment. And I know that, a lot of people like to look at, we need to employ as many Guyanese as possible, or 100 today and 200 the next time. But sometimes it's not always about the quantity. In many cases, it's often about the quality as well. What type of jobs are Guyanese are they going to get? And I know that there are certain countries, and I'm sure you're aware of this as well, where they say, okay, you know what, even if you're going to have Guyanese, or our citizens, getting some of the low-level jobs or low-paying jobs, we still want to see our citizens progressing and taking on those managerial positions or those other executive positions in the industry. So what is your take on that, and do you believe that that is a direction that we should head in as we prepare our policy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, and I can link it to one of the early comments that you mentioned in terms of training and knowledge. There's a series of jobs that can be taken by national in Guyana or in any other country when it actually comes to an energy investment of this size. In 2-5 years, there could be some more, as long as you have the training to accompany people. And I can assure you that no energy companies. All energy companies are interested and serious about diversification of employment, especially at the senior level. You see a series of companies, especially from Canada or from Europe, that demand more and more, upper management for not nationals, but also from different genders in the company. So those are an element when I'm talking about, a contribution to a country. Those are elements which are very interesting when actually infused into different, host nations. I'm not specifically thinking about Guyana. I'm also thinking about African nations on this case. But here the idea is it's interesting to be able to not only look at the number of jobs. I was saying I understand the importance of a quantified number to have a target, but also look at other elements, which is a long-term commitment to having young Guyanese learn either as subcontractor, not only in terms of employees direct, but learn skills. And there are a series of projects. I know a lot of different companies in countries in Latin America or in Africa that have very interesting training for their subcontractors also, including inside the training for the subcontractor, not only the basics, norms and standards, especially at times of COVID, how do you include, biosecurity protocols and others, but also in terms of, trying to induce basic skills of accountability, of accounting, of different processes that can be great to grow your business outside of the energy sector afterwards. And that's what you want to arrive in terms of the long-term perspective. So that's the main objective for me, is that the law doesn't become too constraining without a capacity to include elements that would be much more efficient into the mid to long run in Guyana on local content.
Great, thank you for that. Now, finally, I'd like to look at incentives versus penalties. There's a debate among countries. What's the best mechanism to ensure compliance? Do we use incentives, or do we go the route of penalties? What is your experience on this particular matter? What is more effective in ensuring country sorry, not countries, companies are in compliance and why?
So let me just say, if you're looking at incentives or penalties, that means that you already failed on both the side of the company and the government. That means that the objectives shared by both to actually really develop a local workforce and ecosystem has not been achieved, and there was no compliance. And so you have to look at the fact that this can also be the responsibility not only of the energy company. The perception from energy company usually on local content, especially when it becomes indirect to induced, is that the energy sector money should just be a leverage, meaning that providing some capital, but as a minority partner, meaning that there's got to be other, development, and there are, some, a series of international organizations that fund some projects, especially in Guyana today, and so that fits there. But if this is not clearly in place, and if the government was not committed to this, then indeed you arrive to a situation where maybe the target has not been achieved. Now, was it that the number is not achieved, but there's clearly some elements of progress from the energy company and that falls short of the actual percentage, then going with a penalty that doesn't make sense. Looking at trying to develop more incentive or larger, let's say, let's commit more budget from the energy company, being more adaptive in terms of how you follow up into this, and a bigger commitment to the national development after 2 years, if the target has not been reached, is much more clever on this element. And so I'm just saying, going with just a number and a penalty without a real fruitful engagement and transparent engagement to try to see, areas of expertise when you can have really a leader of the Guyanese economy 20 or 30 years from now. There are elements of supplies or maintenance, some lower skilled jobs maybe at the beginning, but that can be ramped up. There are a series of methodologies that can be used, but there also needs to be the commitment from the government and different organizations in Guyana to this dialogue. And then you arrive indeed to a success. If not, it's a failure, but it's a collective failure, and you need to be clever about how you penalize this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pierre. We will conclude this evening's program with key takeaways. I'll let you go first.
Well, no, it's a key takeaways. It's a very fascinating topic. The inclusion of a large sector, especially the energy sector, which is a very specific extractive sector in Guyana. You have to look at those issues comprehensively, looking at not only the economic elements of local content, but also social governance and being able to raise Guyana in terms of economy and country through the energy sector. There's a lot of topics that we could cover in next conversation, but feel free to ask questions, and then Kiana, it'd be a pleasure to join you another time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pierre. For our listeners, if there's anything that you can take away from tonight's program, it's what I'd like you to just keep in mind, that local content at its heart has to do with the training and hiring of locals, giving first preference to those people, and ensuring that we give first preference to local suppliers for procurement of goods and services, and in doing so that we build in-country capacity, and the type of capacity that creates long-term value for not just current but future generations to come. Once again, Dr. Pierre, thank you so much for being part of tonight's discussion and our first interactive session. Though we didn't get any calls or messages, I'm sure that a lot of our listeners would have learned something tonight, and I am grateful that you were able to be part of tonight's dialogue. So we hope
Next
to
time.
have you back again. And
Yes.
to our listeners, wherever you are again, thank you so much for participating, and we hope to have you back with us next week, same time, same place. Do have a wonderful evening.